Hello, everyone. This is Pastor John from Third Presbyterian Church. Thank you for joining us for week 11 of Amazing Wisdom, Amazing Women. This week, we're going to be looking at Esther. Let's begin with a little bit of Esther's story. Esther is only one of two women who have a book named after her in the Bible. And her story is told in great detail in this book. As far as the book is concerned, it's rather long because it does go into so much detail. Her story is told when she also lives entirely in Persia and not in Israel. So she is of Jewish descent, but she's not living in Israel because they have been dispersed to first Babylon, and then when Babylon was conquered by Persia, now they're living in Persia. And she, in fact, doesn't even have a Jewish name. Scholars believe her name was a derivative of Ishtar, who is the female fertility god of the Babylonians. Others believe that her name reflects a word that means star. So this is the setting for Esther. She's of Jewish descent. Apparently, before the captivity, her lineage can trace itself back to Israel, and her ancestors were then brought into Babylon during the captivity, and then they continued to reside there when it became part of the Persian Empire. And she very likely was probably born in that area. So even though she would have been of Jewish descent, she would have certainly been part of that particular culture. Now, the entire story of Esther takes place in a city called Susa. And here's a map showing the ancient location of these various cities. And this, of course, is not in the Holy Lands, but this is where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers come together to empty into the Persian Gulf. And this is pretty close to the area of Baghdad today. But you can see by the purple arrow that that's where Susa is. It was one of the regional capitals of Persia. Each one of these regional capitals would have a king who would oversee that particular region. Scholars have estimated that Susa probably at that time was more than 1 million people, which would have been larger than any city from Israel. And again, scholars believe that Esther was probably born and raised there in Susa, even though her relatives were of the Jewish faith. And again, we're reminded that the Jews were taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire, but the Babylonians were overthrown by the Persians with Alexander the Great, and so now this area was under the control of the Persians. Now, there's an interesting bit of controversy. The name of God is never mentioned in the book of Esther, which was part of the requirements for books being considered to be in the canon. They had to contain the name of God, but Esther does not. And there's a huge debate as to why this book was included in the canonical books, since it did not contain the name of God. And also, many question whether Esther really practiced the Jewish faith. She had been raised in that from an ancestral standpoint, but she was living in Persia. Perhaps she was born and raised in Susa, and that she might have adapted to the culture of that particular region and not really been so involved in practicing the Jewish faith. So that's a bit of a controversy that surrounds this story. Now, there are some players that take place in the story. Oftentimes, this story is thought of as being this Hollywood blockbuster type story with all of the plots and subplots that are going on. But the first character that we look at is a guy by the name of King Xerxes. He was the king of Susa and the surrounding regions, and he has a wife by the name of Queen Vashti. Now, we're not really sure about that relationship, but I don't think it's a very good one, because as the story of Esther begins, King Xerxes is having a party, and he wants Queen Vashti to come and be his trophy wife on display at this party, and she refuses to. So Xerxes decides that maybe it's time for her to no longer be queen. And her name, of course, is Queen Vashti. So she's not very much in the picture, only at the beginning of the story. Then, of course, there's Esther, who is our main character, and we'll say a little bit more about Esther as we get along. Esther has a cousin by the name of Mordecai, and he plays an important role in this story. And like all good blockbuster stories, there has to be an evil person, and Haman is the evil person in the story. Let's read from Esther 2:12 through 14 from the NIV. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed by the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. So let's have a little understanding of what's going on. The king has a harem, and the harem is made up of women who are what are considered concubines. So concubines in those days basically had one function: to provide sexual favors for the king. Now, they were treated very well. They lived in the palace, and they were taken care of because, after all, their job was to please the king. So when Xerxes decides that he wants to select a new queen because of Vashti's disobedience, he then begins a long process of examining these concubines to see if one of those concubines could become the next queen. And so, as the Esther 2:12 through 14 explains to us, he summons these women in after almost a year's worth of training. He summons them in, and they engage in him and whatever he decides they need to engage in. And then they return back to the harem, and only if he calls them back by name do they get a chance to come back and be in his presence. Xerxes has kind of the best of all worlds there. He has all these women at his disposal, and they can come and go as he pleases. So Esther is part of this harem, which is kind of interesting, that she's willing to be a part of this group whose sole purpose was to sexually please the king. Now we read further in Esther 2:17 through 18. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Obviously, Esther made a lasting impression, so lasting that the king was willing to now get rid of Vashti, the queen, and appoint Esther to be his queen. Now, as we unfold the story a little more, Esther has a cousin named Mordecai. Mordecai is, of course, also Jewish, and as such, he's very strongly committed to his Jewish upbringing, and he refuses to bow down to a king's order that says whenever the king passes or any of the king's top advisors pass, that he should bow down. Well, Haman, remember he's the evil one, is one of those advisors, and he notices that every time he walks by this particular gate and Mordecai is at the gate, he refuses to bow down. When questioned, Mordecai responds with the only person he will bow down to is the true God. Well, this infuriates Haman, and he begins to hatch a plan to get rid of not only Mordecai, but all those who are of his same faith, in other words, the Jews. And he convinces the king of his plan. Now, one of the things that's not revealed yet in the story is that Esther is, of course, Jewish. She doesn't reveal that. No one knows that. And that's probably because she was born and raised in that area, and it had been maybe several generations since her Jewish roots. And so no one really knew exactly what her roots were. But listen to Esther 3:13. Dispatches, so this would have been from the king, dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. So the king makes a decree to go and do this. So Haman goes to the king, tells the king that none of the Jews are obeying any of his commands. So Haman requests that the king issue this decree. The king does in fact issue this decree, unknowing that his wife is Jewish, and they begin to send out these dispatches that on this certain day, all the Jews will be eliminated. Mordecai then turns to his cousin Esther and asks for her help. He knows that she has the ear of the king, and he asks her to help. Now, at first, as the story unfolds, she hesitates because she's the queen. She has great favor of the king. That gives her a really high place in society. And the question then becomes, should she keep her heritage a secret, thus preserving her place as the queen and all the benefits thereof? Or should she come and confess to him, hey, if you're going to get rid of all the Jews, that must mean that you're going to get rid of me? At first, she hesitates. But let's read what it says in Esther 4:12 through 14. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Let's listen to this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time? So let's unpack this a little bit. Mordecai responds to Esther's hesitancy, and he says, you may think by staying silent that you're going to avoid the king's decree, but God's going to save God's people. And so if the king's decree does come to fruition, then God's going to bring somebody along that's going to save the people, and that person will remember that you, given the chance to save the people, did not, and so you will be found out, and destruction will come to you and your family. But then there's an interesting twist that Mordecai throws in his response. The very last sentence, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Now, good Presbyterians would say, aha, that's predestination. That Esther became the queen because she was predestined to then save her people when that time came for the people to be saved. Now, taking a step back from being just Presbyterian, there's an important theology there. Does God put people in certain circumstances and certain places at certain times because they are going to provide a key or important role in continuing God's story on earth? And many look at the story of Esther and say that's exactly what the story of Esther is all about. It's about recognizing and realizing that God has placed you in that circumstance at that time to be the voice and the messenger of God. So that's an interesting point that Mordecai makes. Well, apparently, Mordecai's argument, plus perhaps God's voice to Esther, causes her to change her mind. Now, the story of Esther is full of these plots of twists and turns, and we could spend hours going over the detail of the story. I once upon a time was part of a wonderful program presentation on Queen Esther. It was an audience participation program, and it really laid out the story with all the twists and the turns, but it was fun because it was an audience involved story. So rather than go into all those details, let's just summarize. King Xerxes finds out that it was Mordecai who brought notice to the palace of a plot to kill the king, and as such, it saved his life. So while Haman is out trying to get rid of all the Jews, the king realizes that his life has been saved because of what the Jew Mordecai did, and so the king arranges to have a reward for Mordecai. And as this is all going on with all these plots and twists, Esther invites the king and Haman to a banquet. Now, eventually, as all these twists and turns are taking place, she reveals that the plan to kill all the Jews would mean that she would be killed, and also her cousin, Mordecai, the man that saved your life, would also have to be killed. Well, once the king puts two and two together, he's infuriated, and the table gets turned on Haman, who's suddenly led away and hanged on the same gallows that he built to hang Mordecai. So Esther takes a risk. She decides to tell the king to tell all. And in that process, she doesn't know how the king's going to react. But she looks at her faith, the faith from which she came. And she believes that if she's truthful at that point, that God will protect. And then maybe she is the one who's been called to bring about the saving of her people in that place and at that time. Listen to what it says in Esther 7, 3-4. Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." So here in Esther 7 is where Esther, the queen, goes to the king with all honesty. Now notice at the very end, she says, you know, if it would have just been that all the Jews would have been sold as slaves, I wouldn't have bothered you about this. But you're asking that they be destroyed, killed, and annihilated, so I have to come to you and confess to you that that would include me, and she infers at a point too that that would include Mordecai. Now the king hears her concern, and he realizes that his decree is probably not a good one. But here's the problem. In those days, under the Persian rule, a king's decree was not reversible. Now you might say, why in the world would something like that take place? I mean, we have rules and laws today in our nation, and those laws are always being changed or overturned, or they're being replaced by another law. Nothing is absolute without fail. But back in those days, a king's decree was very, very important. And so the fact that once the king issued the decree, he couldn't take it back, meant that kings would be kept from just making decrees on a whim and a wish. In other words, if the king woke up one day and felt bad about something or didn't feel good about something, and he said, I want all males over the age of 60 to be killed, and that was his decree, well, he couldn't go back on that decree. And so before kings would issue these decrees, they would give a lot of thought and a lot of consideration, because once the decree was sealed with the king's signet, then it could not be changed. But what Esther and Mordecai then present to the king is, we know you can't reverse that decree, but give the Jewish people a fighting chance. As they are attacked in the different areas by these people who are out to kill them, let them have the right to assemble and bear arms, basically, and allow them to fight. And if they beat any oppression, then they would be entitled to all of their possessions. So basically, the decree was for everyone to go after the Jews to kill them, annihilate them, and have all their possessions. And now you can simply say, well, the Jews have the right to defend themselves. And if they win, then they get to kill and annihilate and all the possessions of the person that they kill, which kind of levels the playing field and is a little bit of a deterrent then for the people going out and attacking the Jews, because it's not just a matter of attacking them. If they lose, then they run the risk of losing everything that their family has. So that put a huge damper on this decree to kill, but it also did something else for the Jews. It made them a much stronger and more vibrant people because they had to defend themselves. And so that's the story of Esther. Her story is an important part of the Jewish history, so important that they've actually named a holiday called Purim. Purim means from the lots, which is how Haman chose by lots to determine what day the Jews were supposed to be annihilated. And so the Jews celebrate by a holiday called Purim. It's celebrated on the 14th day of the month of Adar on the Jewish calendar. And this year it was celebrated on February 25th and 26th. Now it consists of a giant feast. It consists of giving one another gifts, but also giving gifts to those in need. And the story of Esther is read in the synagogues, and oftentimes people will dress up in costumes, and they'll oftentimes wear masks to show that they are hiding from this decree, but they're also celebrating that God, through Esther, gave them the power to fight off this decree. Well, let's look at the wisdom of Esther, as we've been looking at the wisdom of all of the women that we've looked at. As the story begins, there's the appearance that even though she has Jewish roots, she's been enculturated in the Persian society. She must have had great beauty and an inviting personality because she was part of the harem for the king. So this is an age-old question. When someone is of a particular faith, but they are raised in a culture where that faith is not the dominant faith, do they become enculturated to the point that they accept a new faith, or do they hang on to the roots of their old faith? And that's a bit of a struggle that we have going on in the United States right now. We have lots of folks that have come from different lands and they practice different faiths. How does that practice of that faith adhere to the culture in which they live in America? And do they give up some of the practices of their faith in order to become enculturated into the American culture? Well, it appears at the beginning of the story of Esther that she has done that. She's Jewish by birth, but she's enculturated herself into the Persian culture. Now, she's willing to give herself and her body to be part of the king's harem. As part of that, she finds great acceptance by the king, and she's chosen to be his next queen. Scholars will debate always why she chose to be a part of the harem, and others will say because that's how God laid out this plan for this story to take place. Now, she's watching a bit from the sidelines because she doesn't want to get involved, especially when there's a plot against the Jews. But her cousin, even though tries to convince her, she's reluctant at the first step. But deep inside her is this faith. And apparently God reaches out to her through the words of Mordecai and perhaps that still small voice. And she does agree to take the giant risk of taking a stand for her people. She does exactly that. Perhaps Mordecai was right. Maybe she was put in that place at that time by God to do exactly what she did in saving her people. And she continues then to be an important leader for the Jewish people. So I guess in looking at Esther, probably the main thing that can be taken is, does God place us in certain places at certain times to be spokesperson? Are we to share our faith? Are we to take a strong stand in our faith as a way of showing others how important our faith is to us? That's certainly the wisdom we find in Esther. Thank you again for joining us this week for this Bible study. We're going to continue as we look at Rahab. Rahab was also practiced what's considered the oldest profession. She was not a concubine. Concubines were part of a harem that was designed to please the king. No, she actually sold herself, and she was that oldest profession that we know as prostitution. And yet God uses her to save God's people. Another interesting story. Have a blessed week. Enjoy this season of thinking about the coming of the birth of Jesus, and we will see you next time as we discuss Rahab.